Section 13 of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Philip Snowden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. More about Georgia. After 3 interesting and informing days spent in Tiflis, a city beautifully situated upon many hills, we left for a 10 days excursion into various parts of the country. The first trip was to Kazbek in the Caucasus Mountains. 8 automobiles, with a complete camera and moving picture equipment and a couple of newspaper men, drew up in front of our door at 7 o'clock one morning. The rain poured in torrents. The air was hot and sultry. We were advised, none the less, to take with us the warmest wraps we possessed, as we were to climb several thousand feet before the end of the day and sleep in the mountains. I made an entente cordiale with 2 of the Frenchmen in order to exercise my French, and we 3 packed ourselves into one of the roomy cars very comfortably, and off we went. Despite the weather, it was a gay cavalcade which dashed along the great military highway, one of the finest engineering feats in the world. The rain became steadily less persistent after the first half hour. The clouds began to disperse and the sun to peep out at us. About 2 hours' distance from the city we were hailed by a brown, shaggy figure standing in the middle of the road. On either side of the road was a group of picturesque peasant folk in their rough, homely garb. The men were on one side, the women on the other. An ancient priest was amongst them. The chief peasant advanced to the first car bareheaded, carrying bread and salt. His companion held a large horn of sour, strong wine. We were invited to break bread, to eat salt, and to taste the wine, all of which we did punctiliously. Their faces broadened with happy smiles as they passed from car to car. Huge bunches of grapes followed. The women threw flowers to us. The lips of the bearded priest moved as if in prayer, and his hands were raised to bless. The little children broke from the sides of their mothers and clapped their tiny hands. At last the horn sounded, the signal for departure was given, and to the roar of cheers, the waving of hands, the curtsying and the smiling, we left this patriarchal scene, full of thoughts of early Bible lessons and the pictures of the shepherds of the East. Some of the young men wore curious yellow wigs of unsewn sheepskin, which looked like a mass of tangled blonde curls, contrasting sharply with their laughing black eyes. One young giant, wearing a sheepskin wig and carrying a heavy stick, suggested the traditional Esau tending his herds and flocks. On we flew, through the richest scenery, hourly becoming more mountainous. The road continued admirable. The sun broke dazzlingly through the mists. The aspect of the country was that of a soft, delicate patchwork in shades of green and gold. There were no hedgerows. There were no glittering scintillations of light and atmosphere, no hardness of outline as in Switzerland. All was soft, suggestive, seductive. Little wooden houses perched upon the rocks and ledges. Large patriarchal farmhouses lay in the valleys. Bright rivulets flashed in and out of the sedge. Occasionally we passed a broad stream or a lake, or paused to drink from a sparkling waterfall. Higher and higher we climbed, the sweet air growing rarer, the habitations less numerous. Eagles screamed aloft. An ancient castle or faded monastery, incredibly old, stood out here and there upon the landscape. Everything spoke of a peaceful, happy peasant life, of rich flocks and autumn plenty. At intervals the cars were stopped for some radiant welcome of us by happy villagers. Sometimes we made little speeches to them, which were translated by a young Georgian officer. Bread and salt, wine and fruit, song and dance, merry words and gentle prayers and fierce patriotic vows. It was all very wonderful and very moving to the men and women from the West. A tiny peasant boy danced for us shyly at the little town where we lunched, and imagination removed that boy to the Opera House in Petrograd, or to the Alhambra in London, there to delight the sophisticated city folk with his mountain-born grace and incomparable agility. The Georgians are a race of dancers. Their feet and hands move instinctively to a gay tune. The lilt of the song is in my ears as I write. On and on we went, higher and yet higher. The sun was beginning to go down. Should we reach Kazbek before it quite set? Should we see the gray peaks before darkness came down upon us? We wished that we might. We wrapped our furs more closely around us. It was really cold now. Our faces were sore with alternate cold wind and hot sun. We chaffed one another on our personal appearance, our red noses, suggestive of a certain want of sobriety. The peaks grew higher. Round first one and then another, we dashed at the maddest pace on those narrow roads. Up and up we went. Now the road narrowed dangerously, the valleys darkened, the gloom gathered on the hills. The solitary peasant at the head of the pass stood gazing after us with astonished eyes, leaning upon his staff. Round the last corner we panted, our machines steaming their protest, when suddenly there burst upon our awestruck gaze Kazbek, the prime of mountains, its immense snow-covered peak glowing rose-pink in the last rays of the setting sun. One glorious instant, and it was gone, shrouded in shadow and mysterious gloom. Up one more slight incline, and then began our descent. It was quite dark by this time. We settled down to quiet reverie upon the majesty of the mountains and the beauty of the starry night. With startling suddenness, wild shrieks tore the air, and the mad clattering of innumerable horses' feet coming towards us along the pass. We sat up, startled. What on earth could it be in that solitary place? It was not the screaming of eagles, nor the roar of wild animals in pain. That steady patter of feet, growing ever louder, was of horses ridden by human beings. We were within a few miles of the Russian frontier. Perhaps this was a raid of hungry Bolsheviks. If so, what were we to do? Unfortunately for our safety, the Georgians carried arms. At one of our pleasant stopping places they had practiced their arms on improvised targets. The picturesque mayor of Tiflis, for a wager, had hit the bull's-eye at 30 paces, the target being a white handkerchief on the branch of a tree. There would certainly be fighting in the event of a collision with the Bolsheviks. And then, what? The foremost emotion was curiosity, not fear. Renaudel stood up and peered into the blackness. Marquet mounted the seat. I hung out of the car at the side. We could discover nothing. The sounds were coming nearer. They came from either side as well as in front. Shots rang out. Wild whoops added to the mystery and the clamor. Suddenly, from out of the mountains on both sides, almost into the cars where we sat, leapt ferocious horsemen, black and bearded, by the score. They were dressed in native peasant warrior style, with swords and pistols, curved scimitars, and studded shields. Their headdress was of various kinds, round astrakhan caps, or the captured peaked caps of the enemy across the border. The heads of most were uncovered. Broad, spreading, square-shaped astrakhan capes, a family inheritance perchance, covered the more sober riders. They rode hardy mountain horses or shaggy ponies, and rode them with amazing skill, picking up their dropped swords as they galloped, and performing other feats of astounding dexterity. They were of several tribes, these peasant soldiers of Georgia, of terrifying aspect, wild and untamed, but withal the merriest, most engaging lot of black-eyed brigands that ever stepped outside a cinema show. We were out of the modern world and had moved back through 1,000 years of history. This gallant company had assembled to conduct us into Kazbek, the most original guard of honor that ever took charge of the guests of a government. At their head galloped a particularly attractive ruffian, carrying a red flag on a long wand. How he contrived to carry this heavy pole in one hand, holding it perfectly erect, and to control his spirited horse with the other, was one of the wonders at which we marveled greatly. It seemed as easy as falling off a log to him. He led the procession in the 3-mile gallop to Kazbek. On either side of the cars ran torch-bearers on horseback. The 50 attendants grew to 100 as we neared the city, the 100 to 200, the 200 to 300, 400, 500. In addition were women and children in the town, waiting to help with the songs and the dances. The old church in which the address of welcome was to be delivered was too small for the company assembled. We held the meeting in the churchyard, and spoke to the people from the top of a broad wall. I never heard Mr. MacDonald speak better than he did to those grim but simple mountain warriors, reminiscent as they were of the shaggy Highlanders of his native Scotland 3 centuries or more ago. I cannot write about the hotel in Kazbek. It was unbelievably awful in its primitive arrangements and its dirt. The food was abundant and of good quality, and the host was more than kind. To make us feel more at home and more secure, exuberant young warriors during the whole night at intervals flashed past the hotel on horseback, firing shots as they galloped. And towering high and white in the risen moon, like a stern but indulgent father, was Kazbek of the everlasting snows. On the morrow morning we took a trip to the Russian frontier to pay our respects to the Bolshevik guards, and to give some of our friends the satisfaction of saying they had set foot in Russia in defiance of Lenin and Trotsky. There the poor fellows stood in frayed uniforms with the red star in front of their peaked caps, looking dull and lonely and tired. They were very pleased to see us, and our cigarettes and chocolates gave them great satisfaction. "Poor devils," said a sympathetic delegate. "They must have an awful time in this lonely, God-forsaken spot." No attempt was made to engage them in argument, nor to weaken in any way their adherence to their government. But one young fellow volunteered to us in excellent French as we parted: "Nous ne sommes pas communistes, mobilisés." Perhaps in some respects the most amazing reception we received was at Kutaïs, the ancient capital of Georgia. Literally the whole city turned out to receive us. Masses of people assembled outside the station. Beautiful white-frocked children, with wreaths in their hair, lined the road from the railway cars to the carriages, throwing flowers in our paths. The streets were lined half a dozen deep for the mile and a half to the public park where the great demonstration was held. Here there was an enormous concourse, and we had a great time with these happy folk. Borjum is perhaps the most beautiful of all the cities of Georgia. It is in the very heart of the mountains, and is famous for its mineral springs. The surrounding country suggests Switzerland, with this difference, that for 9 months of the year there is a warm and sunny climate, and a profusion of subtropical fruits of the greatest variety. As we wound through the woods and climbed the great hills on the mountain railway, we felt a regret that Georgia and its beauties are not better known and more accessible to European and American travelers after health and pleasure. Otherwise it could not fail to attract thousands of people content with lesser beauties at a greater cost. At a place called Ikan, about 3 versts from Borjum, is the palace of the Grand Duke Michael Nikolaevich, whose ancient and impeccable servitors, long bearded and profound, ministered to our needs during the whole of a long summer's night. Of this I have already written. The port of Poti we saw through a flood of rain, which filled the streets with miniature lakes, and roused to malignancy a veritable plague of mosquitoes. These vile insects made the hours in Poti a time of intolerable torture, but the ladies of Poti were most kind in their ministrations, and made matters as easy as they could. In an immense church, which had not then been consecrated, reminiscent in size and austerity of St. Paul's Cathedral, we held a meeting, beginning in the early afternoon, and continuing until the light had faded and the fitful gleam of torches lit up the faces of the speakers to 10,000 eager, patient, curious spectators of a dozen nationalities: Turks, Armenians, Jews, Tartars, Russians, and native Georgians, Christians and Mussulmans, soldiers and peasants, princes and workmen, women with and without veils, little children on their mothers' laps, all congregated to see and hear the strangers from the unknown lands of the West. Our practice was to travel all night and speak and visit during the day. Sometimes we did not leave the train, but spoke to the people from the steps of the railway carriage. Sometimes the platform was placed in a field adjoining the railway station to save the time of the delegation. Often carriages were in waiting to take us into the larger towns, where we were shown the more important of the civic institutions. Frequently we spoke 4, 5, 6, or 7 times in one day. I think the minimum number of speeches was 4. And always there were bouquets of flowers and baskets of fruit as a reward. The Georgians are indeed given to hospitality of the most generous sort. Among the interesting experiences they gave us was a visit to the manganese mines. Georgia has some of the richest deposits of manganese in the world. There are already mined vast quantities of this mineral waiting in the restoration in Europe of the amenities of trade and travel for shipment abroad. In the case of this important industry, the principle of nationalization has not been adopted. A heavy percentage on profits is paid by the companies to the government. The managers of the mines are of several nationalities: Belgian, German, and English. The Englishman we met appears to be a favorite with the men. The Belgians were less popular. The German overseer of coal mines with whom we spoke gave the usual impression of very great efficiency, and obviously commanded respect. The rich coal deposits need capital for their adequate working. The 2,000 miners to whom I spoke appeared to enjoy the novelty of a woman speaker. But to say everything that might be said about this gallant little socialist republic, or even one half of what we ourselves saw during our 2 weeks' visit, is out of the question. The impressions formed need time for their ripening, but on certain matters we formed very clear and definite judgments. The Republic of Georgia, about the same size as Switzerland and with the same population, is equally beautiful if it is not even more lovely. It has a good soil, very fertile, with useful deposits of valuable minerals and a rich supply of oil. Its industries might be made very productive if modernized and supplied with the necessary capital. Foreign capital is shy, however, since the Russian Revolution. It fears confiscation by even the moderate socialist government of Georgia, and is certain of it if Georgia comes to be Bolshevized, either by Lenin from the outside or revolutionaries from within. Georgia needs peace and security for her happiness. There is no immediate prospect of either. From the Turks on one side and the Bolsheviks all round, she is in constant danger. I had the very strongest impression, when in Georgia, that the population was overwhelmingly against Bolshevism, and that their support of the Social Democrats was founded on the love of the peasants for the land, and the fear of the bourgeoisie and aristocracy that a worse fate might befall them. I believe it to be true of Georgia, as of other countries whose ancient orders have been overthrown, that the vicious terms of the various peace treaties have united all classes in support of a party which has not failed in government because it has never been tried, and which stands for the national existence against a world of foes combined. In other words, there is a thick streak of nationalism running through every socialist movement of Europe, not excepting the Russian, whose chief leaders only, and not the rank and file to any extent, are believers in that anti-nationalism they falsely parade before the world as internationalism. Surely there can be no internationalism unless there are nations out of which to make it. Since the writing of the above, I have received this letter from Paris. President Jordania is there, in exile. He writes in French, but I have translated the letter. Paris, April 9, 1921. Dear Madam, I enclose the manifesto signed by my comrades and myself, and addressed to all the socialist parties and workers' organizations. You will find in it, in detail, the latest events in Georgia. This exact document gives in brief, amongst other things, the purpose of our action in Europe. It is to expedite the evacuation of Georgia by the Bolshevik troops. The war is not yet finished in Georgia, but it has taken a new form. It is no longer the Republican army which desperately resists the invaders. It is the whole country which fights against the armies of occupation, as it has formerly fought against the powers of the Tsar. The issue of this conflict depends very largely upon the attitude of the workers of the world. Each voice of protest raised against the invaders of Georgia strengthens the power of resistance of the Georgian democracy and quickens the day of its deliverance. In thanking you warmly for all you have done for the cause of Georgia, I count upon your support, dear madam, in this new campaign. Socialist greetings, N. Jordania. Madam Snowden, London. It is a thousand pities that the enclosed manifesto, signed by the Minister for Foreign Affairs, M. Gegechkori, the President of the Constituent Assembly, M. Chikits, and the Minister of the Interior, M. Ramikvili, in addition to President Jordania, cannot be reproduced in full, for it is interesting and valuable history. But in the fears for Georgia already expressed, I had foreshadowed only what has unhappily come to pass. The substance of the document can be given in a few words. It begins by pointing out the importance of Georgia in Bolshevik policy in the Orient, and the desire in Moscow to accomplish its conversion to Bolshevism. For a long time it was hoped to do this by subsidized propaganda from the inside. In spite of a wealth of money poured into the country, this plan failed. Then came an attempt to do so by force. This also failed. A Russo-Georgian treaty secured the recognition of Georgian independence by Russia on May 7, 1920. In November of the same year, Trotsky, speaking to the assembled secretaries of the Communist Party, declared, "The establishment of the Soviet in Armenia is the end of Georgia." The Russian General Hawker was asked to present a report on the number of soldiers and equipment required for the conquering of Georgia. This was in December. The general pointed out that it could be done only with the cooperation of Angora, but from this moment began the massing of Bolshevik troops on the Georgian frontier, notwithstanding the vigorous protests of the Georgian foreign minister. Although it had been clear for long that the Russians meant to attack Georgia, they sought to find some excuse that would satisfy exterior public opinion by discovering a quarrel between Georgia and Armenia over some disputed territory. Part of the Bolshevik army attacked from the Armenian side, Armenia having been compulsorily Sovietized also in the interests of Bolshevik policy in the East. This enterprise was undertaken at the very time when M. Chavordov, the Armenian Bolshevik, declared his willingness to negotiate with Georgia the disputed districts. Another section of the Russian army began to close in from the side of Azerbaijan. Instructions were sent to the Bolshevik representatives in Tiflis to join his agitation to the efforts of the army in the hope of counter-revolution within. Tiflis was occupied after valiant resistance. The Turkish Kemalists, assisted by Bolsheviks, attacked and captured Batum. The whole country was given over to its enemies, who cared nothing for treaties when something crossed their path. Since all this, a treaty between the Turks and the Russians has been signed at Moscow, in which the Bolsheviks are recognized as the masters of Georgia. The Kemalists renounced their aspirations after Batum, receiving for themselves the two disputed districts of Middle Georgia, Artvin, and Ardahan, and a part of the province of Batum. Lenin is making a great effort to reconcile the people of Georgia. He has urged his representatives in Georgia to find a way of reconciliation and a common platform with President Jordania and his friends. But so far the Georgian people have shown no sign of going over to the enemy and forsaking their old leaders and elected representatives. And Jordania, an exile, writes from Paris. As I write, my mind travels first to Russia and the dying population of Petrograd, then to the merry Georgian peasants with their cakes and honey in the fields on the way from Kazbek, and finally to the unforgettable national song which poured from 1,000 throats when patriot soldiers swore to defend their country's liberties with their blood, like the loving sons of every land. End of section 13. Section 14 of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Philip Snowden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Home Through the Balkans. After a very happy 2 weeks in Georgia, we left for the homeward trip. The special train brought us to Batum overnight. The day we spent in wandering about the city's bazaars. Everything was ridiculously cheap for those possessed of English money, though for some curious reason, which I never explored, the Turks and Armenians whose shops we visited were forbidden to accept English pounds. Some did accept them on the guarantee of our guide, an English-speaking Georgian, that no evil would come to them as a consequence. We bought astrakhan caps, Russian boots, silver-mounted daggers, drinking cups, silver chains, furs, and jeweled belts for a mere trifle. In one shop there was a magnificent set of ermine skins for £70, which would have sold for 10 times the money in England or America, had any one of us had enough business instinct to buy. Persian and Turkish carpets were selling for a mere song. The British delegation of 3 kept together during this promenade. There is no reason for making a special note of this fact except this, that each of us can testify to the falsity of a Reuters report circulated throughout England at a later date that Mr. Ramsay MacDonald was mobbed in the streets of Batum by a number of Bolsheviks. Mr. MacDonald was one of our party. We saw no Bolsheviks in Batum, and the only semblance of a crowd was when, in a Turkish quarter, the unveiled Englishwoman showed herself in the shortest dress that had been seen in that quarter since the last batch of American women passed that way. The Turkish women go black-veiled still, generally by their own choice, and their dresses almost touch the ground. Before the steamer sailed, M. Marquet and I drove along the seafront to inspect the tents we imagined we saw from a distance, bordering the coast. They were not tents in the regular sense, but rude shelters improvised with poles and tattered garments, which sheltered the most miserable and squalid mass of wild-eyed human beings it has been my lot to see. It was said that they were Greek refugees, who had fled the approach of the nationalist Turks. A pro-Bolshevik critic of the Georgians censured them severely for not having provided for these unfortunates. But when huge masses of people suddenly hurl themselves upon a community out of nowhere, organization is not simple, especially when means are limited. The condition of some of the German prisoners' camps in England in the early days of the war was very far from perfect, but the suddenness of the contingency, no less than the proportions of the problem, offered a reasonable explanation of the unsatisfactoriness of things. The steamer which took us back to Constantinople brought Herr Kautsky and his wife to Georgia. Kautsky had been detained in Rome with fever for 2 weeks. We had a perfect voyage to Constantinople. The sea was as smooth as a mill pond, and a heavenly moon lighted our path across the waves at night. At Trebizond, several of the party went on shore and braved the questionings of the Turco-Bolshevik governor. But they saw nothing for their pains but a bazaar which was very much inferior to those of Constantinople. We spent 2 days in Constantinople waiting for the transcontinental express. During those days I talked with several people who claimed to speak authoritatively about affairs in Turkey, and checked my impressions of the earlier visit. Lunch at the British military mission and an interview with the Turkish Prince of the Blood rounded off an experience of the city and its problems, too brief to justify the record of anything more serious than general impressions, liable to be modified upon closer acquaintance. And perhaps the clearest impression of all that I received was that of the disinterestedness of the British government in Turkish affairs. France and Italy were clearly up to the eyes in intrigue for positions of commercial and industrial advantage in Turkey. With this in view, they were manifestly encouraging in his defiance Mustafa Kemal Pasha, even whilst they were conspiring to perpetrate the Treaty of Sèvres. Greece, likewise, was adopting the insolent attitude of the conqueror, more galling to the Turks than the domination of any other foe. Upon the commission instituted to govern the affairs of Turkey in general, and Constantinople in particular, England glanced with wary eye at the deeds of her colleagues, France, Italy, and Greece. It might be urged that England has quite enough to do with her own vast territories and enormous responsibilities, without adding to the burden by taking more than a nominal interest in the development of Turkey. Against such a view, the men on the spot protest with indignation. There is a land of inestimable fruitfulness. It lies on the route of valuable British possessions. It is possessed by a race holding high repute amongst the peoples of that part of the world which is not averse to England. Widely advertised Armenian massacres ought not to be permitted to blind the untraveled to the fact that the Turk is regarded very highly by most people who know him well. His faults of cruelty and corruption he shares with all Eastern peoples. His virtues of cleanliness, sobriety, and, in the country, honesty and industry, mark him out for peculiar admiration. I have to confess that I met nobody who expressed dislike of the Turk. I met everywhere people who spoke with contempt of the Greek and the Armenian. "Tell me," I said to a British officer in Constantinople, "why does everybody hate the Armenians? I do not myself know any of these people, but I can find nobody with a good word to say for them. I have just heard one educated man declare that the only thing to do with the Armenians is to massacre them." "It is certainly true," he replied. "There is a saying in this part of the world that it takes 2 Jews to make a Greek, 2 Greeks to make a Levantine, and 2 Levantines to make an Armenian. Perhaps that explains it." "You mean that they are notorious beyond all words for commercial dishonesty and extortionate dealing? But is that all? That is very bad, of course, but does it explain all the bitter hate?" "I don't know, but I don't believe for a moment that it is purely a hatred of Christianity. The Turks are a warlike race. They hate the pacifism of races like the Jews and the Armenians. To them it is effeminate weakness. They despise the drunkenness of Christian tribes. They are abstainers by religion. And the plundering of the peasants by Christian extortioners has done more to set the crescent against the cross than any preaching of Christian doctrine could have done by itself. I am proposing to return to this part of the world, to visit Armenia in the spring, unless the Bolsheviks from Angora capture it between now and then." "Well, good luck to you," said the young Englishman. "Nothing would tempt me to go. Please remember that if half the Armenians reported to have been massacred had really died, there would not have been any Armenians left to visit." The Bolsheviks have captured Armenia, and the Allies do nothing to help. Therein the Armenians have a real grievance. Their really marvelous propaganda had secured them the sympathy of the whole Western world. They had received distinct or tacit promises from the Allies and the League of Nations. But neither the one nor the other has done anything to save them from their frightful fate at the hands of Russian Bolsheviks and Kemalist Turks. Prince S., the nephew of Abdul Hamid, is a cultured Turkish gentleman of the very first order. His beautiful little daughter was educated in England. She speaks perfect English, her father admirable French. Over the Turkish coffee, thickly sweet and delicious, we discussed the future of Turkey. I had met the prince and his daughter first in Switzerland, at Caux, overlooking the Montreux end of the Lake of Geneva. The castle of Chillon and the mountains of Savoy on the French side make a picture of extraordinary beauty. Then, as in Constantinople, he spoke warmly of England. I have seldom met a foreigner who had a higher opinion of England and English institutions. In Turkish matters, the prince appears to stand halfway between the Turkish nationalists and the representatives of the old order. He looks for the day of an independent Turkey, self-governing and governing with intelligence, but he appears to think that day has not yet arrived. Before that, there should be universal education for Turkey, free and progressive. The rich natural soil of agricultural Turkey should be subject to intensive cultivation on modern scientific lines. Land should be made available for all would-be cultivators, estates limited in size, but not alienated from the owners by the state. Till the day of its emancipation arrives, this patriot prince would have for Turkey the assistance of England. It was obvious to the least interested amongst us that Constantinople suffered atrociously from the divided authority of the Allies. Who were their masters, French, Italian, British, or Greek, the wretched Turks really did not know. Each set of nationals in authority got into the other's way. There were general suspicions and dislikes. Could the prince have had his way, Turkey would have been ruled jointly by Turks and British, until education and responsibility had gradually but surely fitted the Turks to be the absolute masters in their own house. This amiable, cultured Turkish gentleman admitted the awful atrocities committed by the Turkish government in the past against the Armenians, and regretted them. His secretary, and not himself, spoke of equally fearful cruelties practiced upon the Turks by Armenians, the same dreadful game of reprisals with which a mad world appears to be anxious to destroy itself. A marked feature of the British personnel in Turkey is the extreme youth of most of its members. Those who do not take themselves and their work very seriously do not suffer. Those who are conscientious and have their country's interests really at heart suffer acutely, not only through the physical strain of getting things done against indifferent officialism in a country of unequaled opportunities and matchless interest, but from the mental pain which is born of seeing great opportunities passed by, or seized by wiser people in the interests of nations other than England. There is a new-born socialist movement in Constantinople. At least, it calls itself socialist. It came into being as the result of a successful tram strike. As a matter of fact, it is really a trade union movement. It has little knowledge of the economics of Marx. Its leader would be described as a radical in England. I have the same view about the socialist movement that Prince S. has about the nationalist movement, that a period of education would be a valuable, and is indeed a necessary precedent to the agitation for socialist government, even municipal government. When we boarded the train in Constantinople, it was intensely hot. Within an hour of leaving, it blew so cold that the women of our party were constrained to put on their furs. For 2 days the intense cold lasted. Not until we had passed over the bleak moor and forest lands of Bulgaria, reminiscent of certain parts of Scotland, did we begin to feel anew the warmth of autumn days. Milder Serbia warmed our blood, and we ventured to make an excursion into Belgrade, where the express rested for 4 hours. Tired of train food, we betook ourselves in a party to the Hotel Moscow, and enjoyed a first-rate supper among the joyous Serbs. I hope to see Belgrade by day, in order to revise my opinion of the city. As it is, I have the poorest opinion of it. Its streets are paved with cobblestones, and are full of shell holes which would hold the proverbial horse and cart. In the pitch black of the night, for the streets were either badly lighted or not lit at all, we were constantly tumbling into the smaller of these unspeakable holes, or twisting our ankles on the round cobblestones. One required the feet of a mountain goat to maintain oneself erect in such abominable thoroughfares. But a pleasing experience superseded the unpleasant memory of Belgrade streets. I had been given a letter to post to Budapest by a lady in Constantinople, who feared it might be opened if posted in that city. I had given a solemn promise that this should be done. To venture into those Belgrade streets alone was impossible. I had to wait until my fellow delegates had done feasting. Time passed, and still they ate and ate. Soon it would be impossible. The train was due to leave in a little while. I waited. The eating went on. I rose to go alone. Monsieur Marquet's kind French heart was touched. He went with me. We wandered over half Belgrade before we found the post office, and when we found it, it was closed. We walked to the back of the premises, and there were 2 young men packing letters into bags. In a mixture of French, English, and German, we contrived to make them understand we wanted a stamp. One of them, smiling broadly, took out his pocketbook and produced the necessary article, sticking it onto the letter himself, which he then pushed into his bag. We laid down a substantial coin, but with a graceful bow and a fine smile, he declined payment. We shook hands cordially and parted, the travelers with a happier estimate of Belgrade than its stones had supplied. If one can, in any real measure, judge a country's state from the railway train, Serbia and the highlands of Yugoslavia are enjoying considerable prosperity. At the time we passed through the country, the same abundance of produce was everywhere visible as in Belgium. In addition, the little pigs for which Serbia is renowned were numberless. They ran all over the lines at the railway stations, and clustered in herds round every cottage door. The neat, bright comfort of the mountain farms of the Tyrol made a very profound impression, and were a real joy to those of us who were on the lookout for as much happiness and prosperity as we could discover in a world torn with sorrow. A rush around the city of Trieste, a long wait in the railway station in Venice on account of a serious railway accident just ahead, a peep at Milan, a glimpse at Lausanne, and we were on the last stage of our long journey to Paris. The journey had been fairly comfortable, with the exception of the last day. There was no water for washing in our carriage. I mean by our carriage the one in which the English delegates were. We gave mighty tips, but the attendant would not be comforted, and refused to get us more water. He protested savagely at the amount of water the English people used. He complained of the number of times we thought it necessary to wash ourselves. We were thoroughly in disfavor. We bore the discomfort and the feeling of not looking our best till we got to Paris. There came relief, cleanliness, and good coffee. 12 more hours and we should see the home faces once more, and recount our adventures to interested friends. Every one of us vowed we would not go abroad again for a very long while. Every one of us has broken that pledge. It must be so. The human spirit, once having escaped from the circumscribing atmosphere of native city or even country, will never more be content to be environed perpetually by so much less than it has known. It must go out again and again to the scenes and the people it has known in other lands, or break its wings against the bars of its cage, imprisoned in the infinitely small and narrow. Let all who can travel, for the broadening of their minds, the widening of their outlook, the strengthening of their sympathies. And let those who cannot travel read, so that they may know what the men and women of other lands are thinking and feeling, and may cooperate with them in the shaping of brighter and better things for mankind. End of section 14. Section 15 of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Phillips Snowden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Distressful Country. Late one evening I was returning home from a Fabian lecture when a tall, middle-aged man, with slightly wavy hair and a pair of merry blue eyes, accosted me. He carried under his arm a large and rather untidy brown paper parcel, which looked as though it might contain groceries, and gave him the appearance of a middle-class father of a family. His voice was soft and pleasant, his accent unmistakably Irish. "Pardon me, madam, but are you an Irishwoman?" he asked interestedly. "No," I replied, "I was born in Yorkshire, but why do you ask?" "Forgive me, but your voice carries a long way, and I could not help hearing a part of your conversation with the lady who left you at Hampstead. You were talking about Ireland. Your voice and the kind of things you said about Ireland made me think you might be an Irishwoman." "No," I said again, "I am not Irish, but I am going to Ireland tomorrow." "Ah," he said, drawing a deep breath, "and why are you going to Ireland at a time like this? Surely not for pleasure?" "No, indeed. There can be no pleasure in Ireland for anybody with a spark of human feeling. I am going to Ireland to try to discover the truth, if that is possible." "You are a newspaper woman, then?" was the next query. I made no further answer, feeling that the conversation with a perfect stranger, albeit a courteous and sympathetic one, had gone on long enough, when he began to speak with added warmth both of speech and manner. "Ah! You English people, you do not understand, you never will understand Ireland. In your imagination, you have peopled our island with devils, and conceive it to be your duty to exterminate the plague. The dirty Irish is the way you think about us. Hunting down Irishmen is by some Englishmen regarded as legitimate sport. I am a native of Cork. I am not a Sinn Feiner. I do not want to see Ireland cut loose from the Empire, and I deplore as much as anybody the murders on both sides. But I understand my countrymen. I doubt if you do. I very much doubt if you can. The differences are too great. But whosoever goes to Ireland without clearly realizing that the English and the Irish are two distinct and separate nations will fail to understand the things he sees and hears when he gets there. I am constantly hearing talk on this side about the possibility of Ireland making terms with Germany, becoming even a German province if she secures self-government. Here his voice became louder and his manner more excited than ever. The newspaper he was holding dropped from his hand and fluttered away in the wind. Surely, if such people understood the racial differences between English and Irish, they would realize that the same applies, though in a much greater degree, to the German and Irish. "Believe me," I said, holding out my hand, "there are many people in this country who do understand, and who labor continuously to create understanding in others. They yearn to bring about peace between the two countries. Between peoples who speak the same language, war is a crime. I am going to Ireland to get more knowledge about her, to talk to her people directly, and when I return I shall join the band of workers for peace and reconciliation." He raised his hat, renewed his apologies for detaining me, and disappeared. Under the gas lamp I caught a glimpse of tears on his lashes. Tears of a strong man for Ireland, his native land, a suffering thing he cannot help. The Labour Party's delegation to Ireland had not included a woman. Several members of the Women's International League and a few Quaker women on errands of mercy had visited the country. This was some time before the Labour Party had decided upon an official visit. The secretary of the party had received from an Irishwoman a letter imploring him to include a woman amongst his investigators, but it was not thought wise to do this by the men on account of the danger and inconvenience. When one of the executive proposed my name as one of the delegates, Mr. Henderson, with the most paternal solicitude, suggested that the executive committee ought not to take upon itself the responsibility of running any woman into such real danger as existed for travelers in general and investigators in particular in Ireland at that time. So the proposal fell to the ground. No such objection was raised when the delegation to Russia was appointed. On the contrary, Mr. Henderson strongly pressed me to go to Russia. I cannot imagine that the concern of this genuinely kind-hearted man for the safety of his women colleagues was in abeyance on that occasion. Mr. Henderson had been to Russia and suffered considerable danger himself. I can only conclude that this serious-minded colleague of mine believed the danger to be greater in Ireland under British rule than under Russia under the rule of the Bolsheviks. I agreed to go to Russia with some reluctance on my own account, not because of any fear of going. Atrocity stories and wild tales of epidemics had no terrors for me. But the time of the proposed Russian visit was inopportune. I had received invitations to go to Poland, Spain, and Hungary. Preparations for the journey to Madrid had already been made and had to be cancelled. But there were no obstacles to the Irish visit. I wanted to go. Irish women wanted me to go. I received one pressing letter after another. The Labour Party's objection was laughed to scorn. I must say, the idea that women who have lived more summers than they care to confess cannot be allowed to take the responsibility for their own lives, but must be a burden and a charge, whether they like it or not, on the consciences of their men comrades, is in these days vastly amusing, particularly to the women of the labor movement, whose conception of progress is of equality of effort, of danger, of suffering, and of reward for men and women. None the less, I understood and valued at its very real worth the altogether gracious and kindly thought which lay at the root of the action of the labor executive. It was impossible to resist the pleading of the Irish women that as many women who could do so should go over there and see with their own eyes what the women and children of Ireland are called upon to endure. On Saturday, January 15th, 1921, I left Euston for Holyhead alone, and without having in any way advertised my intention. I landed in Dublin in the evening and proceeded to friends in one of the suburbs. We drove from the station in a jaunting car. In such a fashion did I get my first glimpse of Dublin under what the majority of Irishmen consider to be foreign occupation. Westland Row Station, as well as Kingstown Harbor, was full of soldiers and police. Passengers coming off the boat were heavily scrutinized. We were closely examined in the train. In the streets and public places of all sorts in every town I visited during the 10 days of my visit, even in country villages and lanes, the atmosphere was tense with the expectation of the sudden assault, the quick firing of rifles, the rough arrest, the climbing of military lorries onto the footpaths, the humiliating search, the heartbreaking insult. Women and men alike feared these things. Here was an equality of treatment which nobody objected to so far as Irish women were concerned, least of all the Republican women themselves, who would think shame of themselves if they were unwilling to suffer what their men are called upon to endure. But the pity of it! Little children are often victims. Boys and girls have been shot dead. On this night the streets of Dublin were lively with the clatter of armored cars and lorry loads of singing soldiers, not too sober. Occasionally a distant shot was heard. Now and then a sidecar packed with merry little daredevils, flaunting their green flag provocatively for the sheer fun of the thing, would rattle past. One trembled for the ignorant folly of madcap youth. My host, who was one of the best known and most highly respected citizens of Dublin, did everything in his power to bring me into touch with every shade of Irish opinion, so that I might judge of things for myself without bias or pressure from outside. I never was in any country where there were fewer attempts to make proselytes. He himself is a Quaker, and has a long record of devoted service to his country and to the less fortunate of his fellow citizens, to his credit, which inspired confidence and respect. His beautiful wife and lovely children gave me a warm Irish welcome, and although an Englishwoman, and therefore a justifiable object of suspicion, I was never permitted for a moment to feel myself an intruder. From Saturday night till Tuesday morning the hours were packed with incident. I think it would have been difficult for anybody to see more people and hear more tales of woe than it was my lot to see and hear during these 10 days in Ireland. Among my new acquaintances were Republicans of all sorts, Nationalist Home Rulers, Unionists, Labor Party officials, trade unionists, Quakers, humble citizens with no particular political affiliations, Catholic priests and Protestant ministers, boys and girls from the country on the run in the city, newspaper men, writers of books and pamphlets, British officers, lawyers by the dozen, ex-soldiers, high-born ladies, the widows of men executed in the rebellion of 1916, suffragettes, women doctors, temperance folk, members of the Irish Republican Army, commercial travelers, and men and women suspected of being British agents and spies. I should like to disclose the names of all these interesting persons. In most cases I have full authority to do so. But when that permission is coupled with a declaration that they do not care 2 pins about the consequences to themselves, I am involved in too great a responsibility to be reckless in a matter where human life and liberty are so manifestly involved. But because I believe even the present British government, more profligate of its power than any government of modern times in this country, would scarcely dare to mishandle a man so great in the esteem not only of Ireland but of the whole world of culture, I feel I may write freely of that towering personality, Mr. G. W. Russell, E., whom I met several times in Dublin, always to my great spiritual profit. Picture a face and figure not unlike those of William Morris in the prime of his life, with a tenderness joined to his strength, which I imagine was less conspicuous in the English poet. Masses of wavy hair tossed back, but occasionally falling over a fine square forehead, a full mouth, glorious eyes full of humor and gentleness, a soft musical voice, the frame of a Viking, the heart of a saint, the imagination of a poet, the vision of a prophet. A man to whom children would run with their troubles, whom women would trust unflinchingly, whom men would serve with utter loyalty, the embodiment of the real Ireland, the Ireland that is not known in England. This is the man whose devoted, lifelong work for the salvation of Ireland is being wantonly and savagely annihilated by British troops. Mr. Russell spoke without a trace of bitterness, though I know he suffers keenly, when he told me of the destruction of Irish creameries and of the difficulties which cooperative enterprise is meeting with in every part of Ireland. He edits the Irish Homestead, and there he has voiced the complaints of Irish cooperators in the language of the greatest beauty. But to hear him tell the story himself was a pleasure fraught with pain to his English auditor. It cannot be that the system of reprisals has become an integral part of the British nation's scheme of justice, he asked, as we sat talking by the fire in the house of a friend. It would be too terrible to think that that were true. The British people do not know all that is happening here, I replied. Oh, I know they ought to. Enough has been said and written about it. The ignorance of affairs outside the little circle of their own interests of the average man and woman makes me almost despair of democracy at times. But there is this explanation of the inactivity of the British public about Irish matters. In the first place, very many people know nothing. Those who do read that part of their daily paper which is not devoted to the sporting news or the divorce court proceedings read a partial tale. The news is generally colored in favor of Dublin Castle and the Blackened Hands. I cannot believe that British cooperators would be content to tolerate the things which are being done to Irish cooperative enterprises if they knew the facts. I was given a tiny yellow book containing the facts, which I promised to help circulate in England. It is an amazing story. The statements would have appeared incredible to me had I not seen with my own eyes the blackened walls and twisted machinery of the gutted creameries in several parts of Ireland. 42 attacks by the Crown forces on these village and country town institutions had been made up to the time of my conversation with E. In these attacks, the factories were burned down, the machinery destroyed, the stores looted, the employees beaten and sometimes wounded and killed. Questioned in Parliament, the government has excused itself by declaring that the creameries were centers of propaganda and of Sinn Féin activity. They allege that in 2 cases shots were fired at the troops from the buildings. The most searching inquiries by responsible people, including Sir Horace Plunkett, failed to produce any evidence in support of the charges of the government. But Mr. Russell is not concerned about the result of these inquiries. He wants a government inquiry into the whole of the circumstances connected with this particularly lamentable form of reprisal, and this inquiry is steadily denied. Why? Travelers in Ireland today see all over the country these new ruins, centers of village industry and culture utterly wrecked, and the peasant farmers and their families driven back to their lonely farms to live in poverty and isolation, driven back to feed not only upon their own scant produce, but upon the black passions of hate and individualism from which the cooperative idea had begun so successfully to rescue them. Surely the English workmen begin to realize the connection between our problem and theirs, said another distinguished cooperator. If our economic life continues to be so seriously disturbed, or if it be destroyed, we cannot buy from England as we have been doing. Do you know that with the single exception of India, Ireland is the best customer that England possesses within the British Empire? The political views of this cultured gentleman are distinctly non-republican, yet his house is not safe from the official intruder, and he is tormented hourly with the sense of outrage and injustice which the destruction of his life's labors must necessarily produce. To us it would be simply unbelievable, but for the other follies we have seen perpetrated by your statesmen, that any government with the least knowledge of the world's situation could willingly add to its dangers and difficulties. Yet I cannot believe that the members of the British government are all ignorant and stupid. This third speaker was a man who had served with distinction in the British Army during the war. But the droop of his figure, the gloom in his eye, the bitter curl of his lips, everything about him spoke of a confidence lost and a faith killed. 2 millions of adult people in Great Britain either wholly or partially unemployed, wives and children beginning to hunger, industrial strife on a scale hitherto unimagined clouding the horizon, men by the million trained to kill, ready to be used by one side or the other in a class war, hate and violence the fruit of it all, and appalling suffering for all classes before one side recognizes the right of the workers to an assured and abundant life, and the other side realizes that Russia's way is not the way even for Russia. All this and more. And yet the British government actually or tacitly encourages the troop to add Irish tens of thousands to the British millions of workless, starving, hating men and women, and is slowly but surely converting the only revolution in history which makes a point of preserving the rights of private property into something which will be akin to a class war for a communist republic, an issue which I should deeply deplore. I am bound to confess that I discovered no substantial evidence that the Civil War in Ireland has either a communist basis or a communist ideal. The utter conservatism of the Irish is the most striking thing about them. Their determination to win self-government is based almost entirely upon that conservatism, the love of the Ireland of history, the passion for the Irish tongue, the devotion to the ancient faith, their love of the soil. These things, and the memory of 1,000 wrongs put upon them by the alien conqueror, have much more to do with Irish discontent than any desire to hold the land in common and convert the industries from private to public ownership and control, which ideas would, indeed, be repugnant to the last degree to the peasant owners of the south and west of Ireland. Speaking on this point with some of the working men leaders, I asked how far, in their opinion, the communist propaganda had captured the Irish workers. Scarcely at all, was the quick reply. There was fearful anger over the cruel death of Connolly. His execution did a great deal to unite the labor movement in Ireland with the Republican Party. It was the sheer brutality of it. The poor fellow hadn't more than 48 hours to live. He had been shot in the scrimmage in Dublin, and gangrene had set in. Yet they dragged him out of his bed, groaning with pain, put him on a chair, and shot him. The brutes! They think it's all in the day's work to shoot a dirty Irishman. But our people will never forget Connolly and the way he died. No, the Irish workers are not communists. They just hate England and want to be quit of her. Aye, and there's the case of Kevin Barry while you're on about the killing. Do you know they tortured that poor lad to get him to tell the names of his comrades? We have his affidavit. They bruised his flesh and twisted his limbs, and then they hanged him. Hanged him, mind you, when the poor lad begged that he might be shot as a prisoner of war. Your Prime Minister calls it war when he wants to excuse the murders of his own hired assassins. But if so, our men are prisoners of war when they are captured. Who ever heard of a civilized nation hanging prisoners of war? But praise be to God, every time you hang a boy like Kevin Barry, you make hundreds of soldiers for the Republican Army. 1,800 men in Dublin joined up the day Kevin was hanged. The little man who thus broke in began to fill with tobacco the bowl of his small black pipe, and when he had lit it he turned on me, fiercely demanding, "Why have you come to Ireland now? Why didn't you come before? Why don't more of you come? How many thousands of our brave boys have got to be killed before you folks find out what your bloody troops are doing to Irish men, women, and children?" And he flung himself out of the room. I felt sorry to have appeared indifferent for so long, and said so to the rest of the assembled company. But to tell you the truth, I have lived all these years under the impression that Irish men and women preferred to win their own battles in their own way, that they regarded rather as an intrusion any effort of the English people to help and advise them. From the first hour of my political life, I have been a supporter of self-government for Ireland, but I never dreamt that you wanted me, or any of the rest of us, to come to Ireland to say so. I believed that you wanted to work out your own salvation. So far as advice is concerned, you were right, said a young fellow with a large freckled face and fine eyes. I reckon the English can't teach us much about politics." "I'm not so sure," I said very softly. "After all, you have not got what you have been fighting for during more than 100 years, and you have not got rid of the oppression that has tormented you for several hundreds of years. Perhaps it is possible that cooperation might have done it. We can all teach each other something. Ireland has glorious lessons for us English. Perhaps you could have learnt a little of something from us." There was a long pause, and I continued. "It is of the first importance to carry the plain, matter-of-fact people of England with you. Ordinary men and women in England have a strong sense of justice, but their imagination is weak. They find it difficult to understand what they do not endure themselves. They find it hard to believe in the wounds unless they can lay their fingers on the prints. You must admit that some of the things that are happening in Ireland are almost incredible. One thing which makes it difficult to open and keep open the minds of English people on the subject of Ireland's wrongs is what they regard as Ireland's wrongdoing, the killing of soldiers and police. Of course, a certain section of the newspaper press exploits this to the last degree. Why do you do it? Why use the methods so hateful in the others? Why put an argument in the mouths of the enemy? Why soil and stain a good cause?" "Because we are at war," was the prompt reply. "You have just heard that your Prime Minister says so. He justifies the methods of the government because it is war. We do not like killing people, but can we be expected to sit quietly whilst our own men and women are killed and their property looted? It isn't in human nature. Would Englishmen sit quiet under such provocation? We don't like it. And remember, we don't kill innocent people like the other side. Every person executed by the Irish, executed, mark you, not murdered, is tried by the Republican courts and found guilty on substantial evidence of traitorous conduct or brutal murder." He folded up the copy of the Irish Bulletin he had been reading, and then proceeded. "I'm glad you came over. I wish others would come. I'm sure you'll help Ireland. Tell your people that if it's war they want, war they will get till every young man in Ireland is dead. Then they can begin with the old men and the women. They've begun with the women. And after that they'll have to wait till the children grow up. But they'll find them every bit as keen as their fathers. It's in the blood of us. There are only two ways to peace, and God knows we want peace. You can either give Ireland her freedom, or you can sink the whole country in the sea. It's the peace of the dead you'll get if you won't have that of the living." It is only fair to say that 9 out of every 10 of the Republicans to whom I spoke expressed sorrow and regret that the policy of violence had been adopted instead of that of passive resistance. "But now that the fighting has begun, it is very difficult to stop it without laying ourselves open to the charge that we are weakening, or without giving the British government the opportunity of saying that its policy of reprisals has succeeded. The very thought of these things is hateful to the sons and daughters of a brave, fighting race." The distinguished old lady who said this drew herself up as she spoke with the dignity of a queen, and flashed swords and daggers from her fine, proud eyes. Her house had been searched twice by Crown forces. They did some small damage to doors and windows, nothing serious, for she is a woman of property and social position, an outstanding example of the thing I found to be true, that the severity of the reprisals, the ruthlessness of the visitations, the length and discomforts of the imprisonments, were generally in proportion to the means, or in accordance with the religious beliefs, of the suspects. Age and sex did not count. During an official reprisal which I witnessed in Cork, the blowing up of 2 excellent shops in one of the main thoroughfares, when armed troops kept the crowd moving, and armored cars, fully manned, kept the roads, I heard an old woman tremblingly ask a good-natured Tommy, carelessly swinging his rifle as he moved people along the pavement, what the matter was. "We're only going to send all you bloody Catholics to hell," was the cheerful reply. To refer once more to the searchings of private houses and shops, I investigated 3 cases, the one to which I have referred, the house of the old lady and her secretary, and 2 others, both shops. The usual practice is to knock loudly and demand admittance, but to give no time for anyone to run to the door, which is frequently burst open. Sometimes shots are fired into the passage as a precaution, killing or wounding, perchance, the man who is descending the stairs to answer the summons, which often comes in the middle of the night. A soldier stands guard over each member of the family. If the house be big enough, each is placed in a separate room. If it be small, they are turned into the streets and guarded there. A rigorous search is made, beds stripped, mattresses sometimes bayoneted, drawers opened and their contents tossed out, pictures pulled off the walls, letters opened and read, cupboards emptied, the whole house turned topsy-turvy. A shop is usually looted of half its contents. Recently, in the attempt to restore discipline, the householder has been requested to sign a paper stating that the soldiers left all in order and stole nothing. But no opportunity of checking is allowed, and the dazed and frightened woman, it is generally a woman, for the men are on the run, signs quickly and would sign anything to get the soldiers and police out of the house and her terrified children into their beds. In the case of the little sweet and tobacco shop, the whole family, including 2 young children and an old woman, were turned into the street at midnight and made to stand there in the pouring rain for 2 hours. The gentle young Irish mother with the soft voice and seductive Irish drawl told me the story. "It was me brother they wanted. He's in the army, but it's weeks since I saw the face of him. I couldn't tell them where he was, but they wouldn't believe me. It nearly broke me heart to see them poke their bayonets through the picture of the Blessed Virgin, and all the swates were trampled on the floor. The bits of tobaccy went into the pockets of the crathurs, and the poor children was getting their deaths of cold in the rain outside. And now the poor lambs will not slape without a light over their beds in the night for the fear of the cruel men that is on them. And what have I done but keep my house and pay my way like an honest woman? Sure," she said, with a droll look and a twinkle, "if I knew where my brother was, would I be telling the soldiers? I would not, indade. Wolfe Tone is the name of him, and wouldn't they be after shooting at sight a man with a name like that?" The Irish sense of humor never forsakes them, even in their deepest distress. Mrs. A. Stopford Green, the widow of the great historian, and herself an historian of merit, told me of a Catholic priest who had his home invaded and sacked. Standing amongst the wreckage of his little home, he exclaimed, between tears and smiles, "Glory be to God! They've taken everything they could lay their hands on. But there's one thing they haven't taken, because they can't take it, and that is the laugh." I came to one house in order to have an interview with a young Irish patriot who is on the run. He came secretly and at great risk to himself. He was cheerful and jolly, but, like everybody else in Ireland, he showed clear signs of strain and of an imminent breakdown. 8 times his premises had been searched, and each time valuable things had been stolen. Even whilst we talked, a telegram from a friend arrived to say the night before they had raided him again and taken away a pair of much prized army boots. A splendid type of cultivated and idealistic young manhood, he was hunted hourly from pillar to post on suspicion of ill-doing, but his life's work had been humanitarian, designed by the slow but sure methods of education and cooperation to win the suspicious and illiterate peasant from his bondage to ignorance and intolerance. He had been tried once and acquitted. He and his friend had been lodged in the guard-room. There was a struggle and bombs, and the dead and mutilated body of his friend was carried out. The story was set about that the 2 of them had thrown the bombs at the troops. The bombs were lying loose in the guard-room. Nobody believed a story so thin. The pacific reputation of the 2 men was well known. Everybody asked why live bombs were left lying about in such a place. Were they put there to furnish an excuse for premeditated crime? Some believed this. Nothing is clear. In the subsequent inquiry before a military court composed of young and ignorant officers with a natural prepossession in favor of their profession and caste, it was denied that Clun's body was mutilated. but a reliable witness told me that he had counted 13 bayonet wounds. The first thing which impressed me about the Sinn Feiners I met was their culture, then their courage, finally their spirituality. I speak now of those I met in the city, probably 200. Many of them would have been shot at sight if they had been seen coming out of their hiding places to meet me. At the moment of writing, more than one of those with whom I talked lies in a dark and dismal prison cell, notably Desmond Fitzgerald, head of the Republican Propaganda Department. What amazed me continually was the entire absence of bitterness in the speech of most of these people. Bitterness they must have felt, and yet so sure are they of the goodness of their cause and of its ultimate triumph that they can talk with calmness and even humor of the tragic events of which so many of them are the central figures. They say in England that this is first and foremost and all the time a religious quarrel, that the domination of Irish politics by the Pope is to be greatly feared if Ireland gets self-government. What have you to say to that? I asked the handsome youth whose effective propaganda has filtered through to every country in Europe. It is one of the important facts of the present situation that the conduct of England towards Ireland is breeding a cynical contempt for England throughout the world. I have to say of the first statement that it is not true, and of the question that the fear is groundless. The Irish priests have tried in vain to stop the ambush. They have denounced it from their pulpits, but they have protested in vain. This defiance is the symbol of a conviction that the place of the priest is at the altar. When he leaves that to meddle with matters which are not his concern, he is thrust aside. I am myself a devout Catholic, but I would not tolerate for a moment the interference of the priest with my politics. Young Ireland will not. Our movement is spiritual, deeply spiritual. But with the methods by which we shall, under God, win this battle with our foes, neither priest nor pacifist must interfere. Subsequent experience confirmed the impression that this is true, that the power of the priest in politics, if it ever seriously existed in Ireland, is rapidly on the wane. True also, I found, was the loathing of the priests for murder. I talked with several in different parts of the country. Murder is murder by whomsoever committed, was the invariable comment on the killing by both sides. End of section 15. Section 16 of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Philip Snowden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. More about Ireland. It is, of course, as difficult as most such things to measure, but in the course of my travels and talks, I receive the impression that there is less of religious intolerance amongst the Catholics than amongst the Protestants, at any rate in the South. The faith of the minority there appears to be treated with greater respect than the faith of the minority in Ulster. I came across numerous instances in the country between Dublin and Cork of a violent distaste for the provocative behavior of bigoted religionists. I spoke with a Tipperary man about the cruel treatment in the Belfast shipyards of the Catholic workmen by the Protestants. It will be remembered that the decline in shipbuilding necessitated a reduction in the staff in the shipyards, and that Catholic workmen were selected to be the victims of the labor depression, and were driven with violence from the yards. It was told me that they were forced into the sea and stoned as they struggled to regain the land. "Serves them right," said this Catholic workman of Tipperary, unperturbed. "They be always trailin' their coats." This good-natured fellow had had a brother killed in an ambush. He had lost his work through the firing of the shop where he worked. He had his own and his brother's family to maintain. Or I would be with the boys in the mountains, I would. He came to the hotel where I was staying to say that some unknown person had stopped him and asked him for the name of the lady to whom he was speaking. "It's one of them dirty spies after you. I just told him you was me half-cousin, Mary Ann Watson of Manchester, and you'd called to see the poor childer on your way to Dublin. So now you'd better be after taking your ticket for Cork, for I'm thinking the crathur isn't believing me at all." I had gone to Tipperary for a sentimental reason. hundreds of thousands of gallant young Britons had marched out to meet the foreign foe, cheering one another and their own sad hearts with the refrain, "It's a long, long way to Tipperary." This song has become for all time associated with the British Army. On several occasions in foreign lands I have asked the orchestra for an English song, or knowing my nationality, the orchestra has volunteered the compliment. It was invariably Tipperary. The very sound of it calls up visions of healthy, sturdy young British manhood marching out in its millions to engage its lives and fortunes in what it believed to be the most righteous war that ever was waged. Surely, I thought, if any place in Ireland should be sacred to Englishmen and to the memory of the 250,000 Irishmen who enlisted in England's battles, it should be Tipperary. But what did I see in Tipperary? The whole of the principal street of this little market town was blackened and disfigured with burnt and burning buildings. A magnificent stone-fronted draper's shop was completely gutted. Such shops as remained were shuttered, for a murdered policeman was to be brought through the town for burial later in the day, and the authorities were afraid of a demonstration. The streets were full of blackened hands, the name derived from the nondescript clothing which these military police wear: black coats and khaki trousers, blue trousers and khaki coats, Scotch bonnets and blue helmets, a mixture of garments as varied as their wearers' breeding. Officers on horseback dashed about furiously. Numerous groups of idle men lolled against the walls, regarding the ruins of their town with philosophy, and curious about the stranger within their gates. Was she an English spy? Was the query in their glances. Is she a Republican agent? The eye of the soldier on duty at the street corner questioned. It was an awkward situation. I had no papers with me, nothing to identify me with one party or the other, and it was a lawless time. 127 buildings in Tipperary, whether town or county was not quite clear, had been deliberately destroyed by fire. The damage was estimated by a lawyer in the district at £300,000. A girl had been taken to the barracks the day before, and not allowed any female attendance. A young draper's assistant had been bayoneted to death in the guard-room a little while previously. Shot trying to escape, was the report from the authorities on a Tipperary lad brought into the barracks dead, but the wound was in the forehead, and men trying to escape do not usually run backwards. The young women of the town rarely undress when they go to bed, so fearful are they of a midnight entry and search. The Irish girl has a delicacy all her own in matters of this sort. The nerves of the children are fearfully affected, and many of them scream in the dark. Ruin, misery, desolation, and death in Tipperary. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It was not very easy to go about Ireland's more remote districts. One day I walked for several miles into the country alone. On the way back I passed a country school. Through the open window came the sound of singing. Sweet children's voices sang of spring and the nightingale, an English nursery song. I stopped to listen. There followed 2 verses of Men of Harlech. The Bluebells of Scotland was the next item on the program. I waited for the Irish song. It never came. A face appeared at the window, a face with the strained look of every Irish eye. The first song was begun again. I walked away very slowly, full of pity. The young voices shrilled forth, "The awkward owl and the bashful jay wished each other a very good day, tra-la-la." Within 100 yards of this school, full of bright young creatures and their sad-eyed teacher, the smoke was still rising from a burning homestead, and the smell of scorched timber spoilt the freshness of the air. A curious adventure befell me on this occasion. I sat on a low wall covered with moss. There had been a heavy shower of rain, and the country was very green and lovely. The sombre hills in the distance were relieved by the intense blue of the sky and white of the clouds. The long white lane wound coaxingly to the west, calling for new adventures. Nobody passed me for full 20 minutes. There was much to think about. the stupid blunders of politicians, and the many injustices of life. I was content to sit alone and muse on things in that loveliest bit of countryside. Suddenly the roar of a motor engine broke upon the stillness, and there flashed past me a large military lorry full of troops with grim faces and poised rifles. 10 seconds later and they were gone, and I too rose to go. At my elbow, as if sprung out of the ground, was an old man who had come silently up during my musings. "You are a stranger here, lady, and not an Irishwoman, and if you will take advice from an old man, you will never sit on a wall in an Irish country lane. Not now, at any rate. I know a man who did that. He was found dead in the lane. He was picked off by a crack British rifleman, who shot at the target from a distance to win a bet. Oh, it was an accident," he added hastily, noting my horrified expression. "It was not known that the chosen target was a human being. It might have been anything at a distance, a young tree, a large stone, anything. What happened once might happen again, and in that red cloak of yours what an excellent target you would be. You take great risks in Ireland during the foreign occupation. Good day to you, ma'am." One day, having succeeded in hiring a car, I drove to some of the more remote farms in the hills I had seen and admired from the side of the road, where I talked with the old man. The youth who drove me was a member of the Republican Army, but a discreet and quiet boy, who would not be drawn into conversation. We sped for an hour and a half along a bad road in a high wind. It was bitterly cold, but fine and sunny. We stopped at the cottage of an old widow to ask for some information, but she lived in hourly terror of the barracks 2 miles away, and would tell us nothing. On we went till we came to a farm at the crest of the hill, standing back a little from the high road. It was a poor farm, one of the poorest in the district. The farmer was a strong, thick-set type, not very easy to persuade to tell his story. His wife was a pale, delicate woman without the words to express all she felt and knew. Her ordinary speech was Irish. We sat down in the kitchen, and the wife worked the bellows till a bright blaze burst from the soft coal piled up on the old-fashioned, huge hearthstone. The water in the large potato cauldron began to steam, and the tiny potatoes cooking for the pigs to stir in the pot. 3 dogs of different breeds invited the stranger to caress them. A couple of cats lay curled up on the kitchen table. A white hen roosted on the top of a sack of grain, and chickens walked up and down the floor. An immense sow peeped in at the door just for friendliness, and turned away when she had satisfied her curiosity. "It was midnight," began the farmer, "and the wife and I were in bed. All of a sudden a bullet flew through the window. Then I knew that the Black and Tans was here. They broke in the door and asked for my lads. The boys was sleeping in the barn. They ran away, but they was caught, and the soldiers made them kneel in the yard with their hands above their heads while they searched the house. They found nothing at all. Then they told the lads to run. They ran out of the gate, and the dirty blackguards shot at them. But they all got away, all but one. He was shot in the arm and leg, and he's lying in the hospital now. We found him in the turnip field the next morning, bleeding bad, for it was 5 hours he was lying there before we found him, the poor lad." He spoke quietly and without emotion, but there was a gleam in his eye that spoke volumes of hate and fury. Later in the day I went to the hospital and saw the wounded son, a beautiful, modest boy, with the sort of open face that invites perfect trust. He told me he neither smokes nor drinks, and passed the cigarettes I brought him to his comrades. "It is the rule of the Republican Army," added the gentle Catholic sister who was nursing these wounded boys, "that no alcohol must be taken. Would to heaven it were the rule of the British Army too. But they tell me that Dublin Castle gives drink freely to the men it sends out upon its black errands." She stopped suddenly, and busied herself with one of her patients in some confusion, for fear she had said too much. It reminded me of a pathetic school teacher in Petrograd, who told me things about herself, thinking I was sympathetic, and then became overwhelmed with fear, lest she had made a mistake and revealed her secrets to a Bolshevik spy. "You will not give me away, dear madame. I have said nothing wrong, have I? Only that we are all very hungry and very unhappy. Say you will not report what I have said. Swear it, swear it." And she pressed my hand in the fear of what might befall her, till I could have shouted with pain. The old peasant wife begged me to take tea, but there was much to do that day, so I begged to be excused, and drove away to a small farm still more remote from the broad highway. This farm was reached through 2 plowed fields. In it lived an elderly farmer, his wife and daughter. I knocked loudly at the door, but there was no reply. I knocked again and again, but nobody appeared. A dog barked loudly, suggesting human habitation, so I persisted, and after a while the farmer appeared and roughly demanded my business. I told him who I was and what my errand, to hear his story and make it known. "And what for should I tell you my story?" he demanded fiercely. "Don't you know? Don't the people of England know it was the English crown that killed my boy? Don't the English people know without my telling them what their soldiers are doing to Ireland? Of course they know, but they don't care. I'll not tell you one word of the tale." His daughter came in, a buxom, dark-haired girl, whose face was black with the smoke from the peat fire, and we two listened for 10 minutes to the most terrible outpouring of hate and rage against England that it has ever been my lot to hear. I sat perfectly still, but the torrent of passionate words brought forth from an inner room the farmer's white-haired old wife, who greeted me with the grace of a queen and tried to stem the torrent of the old man's rage. "I understand, dear friend," I said to the old woman, "I understand. If I had lost a child in such a way, I should probably have said much worse things than his, being a woman." The old man's blue eyes softened a little at this, and after I had tried to make him understand that it was no idle curiosity that had brought me from England to his lonely farm, he said brokenly, "Well, ma'am, you seem to have a kind heart, and if it's really wanting to help stop this kind of thing you're after, I'll try to tell ye." And he tried, but he failed. He broke into awful weeping instead. And when she saw her old man broken down, the old wife fell a weeping too, and there was such a wailing and a sobbing in that little farm kitchen as almost drew the heart out of the body. I took the frail old woman in my arms and tried to soothe her. I begged her to cry on my shoulder. She said she couldn't cry, hadn't cried since they brought the boy home dead. Her eyes were wild and burning. Between dry sobs and moans I got the tale. The men had come in the night, the same men who had shot the lad at the farm below, and the same night, and demanded the whereabouts of one of the sons. Neither man nor wife knew. They had not seen the boy for weeks. They pushed the old farmer against the wall and threatened to kill him if he didn't tell. A young and delicate boy, never allowed out at nights because of his lungs, hearing the noise and the scuffle, dressed quickly and rushed into the room, crying, "Don't shoot my old dad, shoot me." "Ah," said one of the intruders, "here's our man. I knew they had him somewhere." "No," said another, "he's not the chap, it's his brother we're after." "Never mind," was the retort, "this one will do." And they dragged him across the field to the waiting lorry, and there they shot him dead. Trying to escape was the official story, but it was not true, and nobody believes it. If in Ireland you speak of this excuse in any company, there are shouts of ironic laughter. "And it was to save his father my poor boy went with the murdering men," said the poor mother, "and for that they shot him, the black-hearted scoundrels, and no priest with him when he died. But if there's a God in heaven, me poor boy will go straight to his arms, for niver a word of wrong could be said against the lad. He was the best son I had, and a good boy to his father." A small black cross on the side of the road, and the letters R.I.P. marked the spot where this young martyr was killed. I left the farm sick with the sight of so much pain and sorrow. The old man accompanied me to the gate, choosing the path for me, and offering his aid over the bad places with all the instinctive courtesy of his race. His eye lit up when he heard that the President had arrived in Ireland. He idealized De Valera with all the power of his native imagination. He told how, for miles around, men, women, and little children were afraid to sleep in their beds at night, but took to the fields and hills and slept in blankets under the hedges. The wind whistled past me as he spoke, and the rain began to fall, and I pulled my cloak more tightly around me, for I heard with the mind's ear small children in the night sobbing themselves to sleep under the dank hedgerows. I had planned to visit other sufferers, but farther I could not go. The human spirit bruises itself to death in the perpetual contemplation at close quarters of misery and wrong, and relief in action becomes necessary for sanity. I would go to Cork and see the sacked city, and then return to England with the story of it all. The train drew into Cork station an hour late, only 20 minutes before the hour of curfew. The jarvey who drove me to the hotel was determined that I should have a swift view of the ruins, or was it a laudable desire to earn more money that made him take me by a circuitous route? It did not matter. I was glad of the view. And the ruins were softened by the moonlight into a poetry of aspect which the charred walls of daylight could never display. The whole of the town's business center appeared to have been destroyed. It stood out in my mind as comparable with some of the newspaper pictures of Ypres after the great battle. Of course, there was nothing like the same amount of devastation, but the ruin of the particular section which met the eye on entering the city's center was complete and very appalling. The first thing I did at the hotel was to ask for the headquarters of the Society of Friends. My friend, Miss Edith Ellis, was doing relief work in the city, and I had mislaid her address. The Friends would know it. I also inquired for Mrs. Despard, for I had seen a picture of her in that day's newspaper, standing in the ruins with Madame McBride, the beautiful widow of Major McBride, who was executed in the 1916 rebellion. I was told Mrs. Despard had left for Mallow 2 days before. This was disappointing. A tall, evil-looking man, leaning up against the hotel bureau, scrutinized everybody who came into the hotel, and gave the impression of being there for that purpose. I have seen so many intelligence men that I know them as well as I know a Lancashire weaver, a Yorkshire miner, or a schoolteacher from anywhere. I asked if it were possible to have something to eat at that hour, for there was an ominous emptiness in the dining room. This was 8:45 p.m. "I hope, ma'am, that you'll be comfortable here," said a kindly waiter. "I heard you asking after Mrs. Despard. I hope you'll have a better time than the poor lady herself had." "Why, whatever was the matter with her?" I asked, with interest and alarm. "Nothing was the matter with Mrs. Despard, lady, but the poor lady was niver 5 minutes without somebody following her about, though she doesn't know it." "Mrs. Despard wouldn't be troubled about that. She is a gallant soul, and her only concern is the care of the poor and the oppressed. She is an Irishwoman, you know, and a true friend of your country." "Indade, and she is, ma'am, and if it's her friend ye are, you'll be wishing nothing but good to the country too. But be very careful, or one side or the other'll be shooting you. The blood is up in Cork." There was much laughing and screaming in the streets outside, and my sidecar had wormed its way through vast crowds of saunterers in the splendid moonlit evening. The hour for curfew struck, and in an instant an uncanny silence fell upon the city. Indoors, affected by the quiet outside, men crept about softly, or sought their beds early, afraid almost of the sudden and general noiselessness. The only sounds that were heard till the dawn of day were those of the racing lorries full of armed men and the armored cars patrolling the city. Round the bend of Patrick Street they came, noisy and aggressive, to arrest or shoot at sight the unfortunate individual caught walking in the streets after the hour of 9. On the second night a new sound struck upon the ear, cutting the perfect silence with its shrillness. The loud laughing and screaming of coarse women's voices, which suggested unspeakable things. Apart from seeing the official reprisal, to which reference has already been made, and the awful ruins of the city, which included the Carnegie Library and the City Hall on the opposite side of the river, the short visit to Cork was fruitful of the conviction that the unhappy citizens of Cork are placed on the horns of a very terrible dilemma. General Strickland has made them responsible for the outrages on soldiers and police which are committed. He inflicts severe penalties on them for failing to stop them. This they would endeavor to do, but they do not know how, and they are generally afraid to attempt. They believe that the shooting of police is done by people who do not live in Cork. As in all cities, the citizens of Cork are, for the most part, not actively interested in politics. They vote when occasion comes, but this is the limit of their activity, and voting and not shooting is their chosen method of expressing their views. They do not know who shoots. If they did and informed, they would be shot by the Republicans. As they don't know and cannot inform, they are made to suffer reprisals by the British authorities. Their position calls for the utmost sympathy and understanding. I cannot help feeling that the citizens of Cork who are against violence would be greatly strengthened if the findings in the official inquiry on the Cork burnings could be published, and adequate punishment administered to the evildoers. This has not been done. British justice in Ireland is not even-handed. Somebody is being sheltered. The Black and Tans would mutiny. The authorities themselves organized the looting. All sorts of things are being said. All sorts of things believed. The belief in British fair play is gone. Can it really be, after all, that we are living on our tradition in this matter, as are the French on their reputation for good manners? Back to Dublin from Cork, and a final meeting with my good friends there. It was a splendid company, representative of the brilliant wit and intellect for which Ireland is so justly famed. I was going home, so it was entirely proper that these last hours should be devoted to question and answer on both sides. I spoke again of the difficulty of winning and maintaining sympathy for Ireland in England so long as the killing of British soldiers continued. All deplored the necessity, but those who believed that the method could now be changed were in a small minority. "Ask Englishmen who complain 2 questions," said a distinguished professor, whose name is known wherever scholarship is respected. "Who began it, and how would they behave in the same circumstances?" "Forgive the question," I said, "but who do you really think did begin it?" "The Republicans certainly did not," said a young lawyer, rather hotly. "I am not a Republican, but one must face facts. For 2 years after the killing of Irish civilians by British Crown forces, no member of the forces lost his life. In the meantime, unspeakable humiliations were put upon the Irish people. The miscreants who killed 2 Irish civilians in 1917 and 5 in 1918 were never brought to trial. No steps were taken to bring them to trial. In the meantime, innocent men on the Irish side were arrested and imprisoned without trial. Private houses were raided and their contents stolen. Meetings and newspapers were violently suppressed, and deportations were very frequent. In 1918 alone, 1,117 Irish men and women were arrested for political reasons. 77 Sinn Féiners were deported in 1 month. 260 private houses were raided by night, and 81 meetings were broken up with bayonets. The bottom fact of the whole trouble lies in this: the British government is uneven in its administration of justice, and it breaks its pledges. It hangs the casements and puts the Carsons in the cabinet. What essential difference was there in their offences? The death of a British soldier or policeman is bitterly avenged even upon the innocent, and out of all proportion to the crime. The death of a Republican is applauded, and that of a non-partisan is rarely even inquired into. Have you seen the kind of thing which is published and circulated broadcast with the approval of the authorities? Here he handed to me a paper, an extract from which I quote. It was delivered to the Cork newspaper offices. Anti-Sinn Féin Society, Cork Headquarters, Grand Parade, Cork. In the event of a member of His Majesty's forces being wounded, or an attempt made to wound him, 1 member of the Sinn Féin party will be killed. Or, if a member of the Sinn Féin party is not available, 2 sympathizers will be killed. Signed, the Assistant Secretary. "And you must agree," said a third speaker, "that Ireland has been very badly tricked by your government. Witness the Convention, and the use that was made of it to impose conscription upon Ireland, the conscription of a country which has been reviled by Englishmen for years, and which it was proposed even then to partition, conscription which was by very many disapproved of for England, accepted with extreme reluctance by Canada, and rejected by Australia. I recalled at this stage of the proceedings the humorous hall porter at one of the hotels who had put his head round the corner of the writing room when I was alone there, and whispered, "John Redmond's the man who made all the trouble. He wasn't clever enough for your Lloyd George. Why the divil didn't he get the promise in writin'? There's no wriggling out of something that's in black and white, with a good strong name at the end of the paper. Sure," he continued, with a roguish smile broadening his honest red face, "isn't it the kingdom of Ivan I'd be after promisin' if I was the Prime Minister and there was trouble brewin'?" I am sure this must have been the man who tried to persuade one of the Labour delegates not to go into the street when the Black and Tans were busy shooting. "But I'm an Englishman, friend, they'll not shoot me." "Sure, sir, and I wouldn't be trustin' them divils. They'll shoot you first, and then find out if you're an Englishman afterwards." "What about the rebellion of 1916? Talk to me a little about that," I said to a young fellow whose keenness was very attractive. It was a very small rising of extremists, a piece of insanity repudiated by nearly everybody in Ireland, a group of idealists who believed they could imitate the Ulster Unionists and enjoy the same immunity, thought they would make a similar demonstration. The hideous severity with which the rebels were treated, and the long continued persecution of perfectly innocent people suspected of sympathy with the rebels, were the causes of the rise of political Sinn Féin. "And now?" I asked. "What is the exact situation now? What are the hopes for peace?" "There is no hope unless the English people wake up, change this government and parliament for one more competent and humane, which will adopt a saner policy, the one for which they say they fought the war. Ireland must have the right to choose her own form of government." "The Irish have chosen their government, and it is working very well," chimed in a determined-looking young woman wearing the uniform of the Irish Republican Army. "All we ask is to be let alone. We can keep order if the English will let us. They cannot do so." I thought, as these stern criticisms of England's government stormed my ears, often expressed in stronger language than I have used here, that it is no use going into the enemy's country if one cannot stand fire. The person who has no facility for getting into the skin of another had better stay at home by his own fireside. The role of political pilgrim is not for him. In fact, there are two governments in Ireland: the Republican government, representing roughly 75% of the population, and the British government, representing the remaining 25%. The will of the majority should prevail in these democratic days. England says not. Very well. If we must die to establish the rights of democracy in Ireland, we are ready. "And we will fight and die with our men," exclaimed a hitherto silent member of the company. She turned to me. "Do you know that the hate of England is so intense in my part of the country that a woman told me she scarcely knew how to bear the disgrace of having had a son who fought for England in the war? And the neighbors are so sorry for her, they are breaking her heart with kindness and pity." "There is an old man lives near here," said my hostess, "who is dying. He has 8 children, and his wife is delicate. He is tortured with the fear of what will become of them when he goes. The priest came to administer the sacrament. 'I will get the boy a place in the munitions,' he said, speaking of the eldest son. 'He will help his mother.' 'Thank you very kindly, father. You mean it well, and you are very kind. But it cannot be. We are not of that way of thinking.'" There was a long silence after this story. Memory took me back to the scene in London when the Irish labor leaders came to explain their cause and solicit our cooperation. "You may remain indifferent or even refuse to help us," said Mr. Johnson, their spokesman. "Your government may torture our women and kill our men by the thousand, but you will never break our spirit." It was a proud boast, but the reason was a revelation. You will never defeat us, for we Irish have a living faith in God. I believe this to be profoundly true, and he will misread the Irish situation and misunderstand Irish men and women who fails to look beyond the picture drawn by partisan newspapers for their own ends to the vision in the souls of those to whom God and country are real and noble passions. But will you take nothing less than complete separation? I pleaded. On the grounds of economy, for reasons of efficiency, for our common safety, is not national self-government within the Commonwealth a happier issue for us all? Ourselves alone was murmured round the room, but from the general smile I felt a lighter heart. Give us the right to choose, free and unfettered, and wait and see. It is the least they can claim, or that the British government can give, in its own interests as well as those of the Irish. It would be an act of faith such as few governments in history have shown themselves capable of performing. But there are national and international situations where only a supreme act of faith will suffice. And this is one of those. End of section 16. Section 17 of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Philip Snowden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. And the fruits of these wanderings abroad are what? For 2 hours I sat in the old-world garden of an English manor house pondering the answer to that question. Old-fashioned and variegated flowers in every color of the rainbow massed themselves around the moss-covered rocks, climbed the walls, and peeped out of the crevices and corners, throwing out strong, sweet scents of the wallflower and the jasmine. The shadow on the sundial crept slowly round its withered face. Tall elm trees sheltered the noisy crows. A bold cuckoo competed with the lark for our attention and regard. A typical English scene, suggestive of peace and plenty, so entirely different from any scene in the torn and stricken lands of Europe. The twofold character of my work abroad has been told in these pages. The physical relief of suffering goes on through the American relief agencies, the Society of Friends, and the Save the Children Fund. The utmost that can be done is but a drop in the bucket of Europe's overwhelming needs. It is only the first dressing of wounds, which cannot be cured except by probing to the cause and clearing away the poison. This is not the business of philanthropy when the cause is political. An exaggerated sympathy, which is the very essence of charitable enterprise, could even hinder the work of political and economic recovery by an uninformed emphasis of the patient's suffering and a forgetfulness of his guilt. A stable internationalism can be built only upon a universal recognition of partnership in the guilt which has laid the world so low. But in such internationalism lies the hope of the future. I returned from my travels reinforced 1,000-fold in the conviction of the necessity of internationalism, if the world is to be saved. With this in addition, that the present problem for mankind is not to persuade the world to internationalism. It is rather to teach it the right kind of internationalism. Internationalism of one sort or another is as inevitable as the rising of the sun. The League of Nations is the second embodiment of an idea which held great masses of men and women before even the first, the Workers' International, was born. This idea can be safely trusted to persist and grow in spite of every menace, because it is in the direct line of political and economic evolution. It is the next inevitable step in the march of ordered progress. In the realms of art, science, invention, commerce, industry, economics, and finance, nationalism is languishing towards its inevitable decay, if it is not already dead. Political internationalism is destined to crown the structure of the world society of the future as surely as night follows the day. But what kind of political internationalism is it to be? That is the question. Heaven forbid that it should be the anti-nationalism of Lenin, wrongly called internationalism, which will prevail over the earth. That would be to menace too alarmingly the truly valuable differences amongst men. The characteristic differences of nations should be, with very great reluctance and only for sufficient reason, sought to be obliterated. The variety in dress, manners, customs, speech of the various races and nations is the very spice of the world's life, which gives it all its flavors. Difficulties of language, so fruitful of the misunderstandings which create wars, should be overcome by the provision of larger educational opportunities, rather than by the establishment of one universal tongue. Esperanto is a wise and simple device to facilitate discussion between men and nations, but the compulsory study of French, German, and English in the elementary schools would be of greater value to mankind than a knowledge of the most useful of languages manufactured for a purpose and not born of a living nation's intellectual and spiritual growth. A knowledge of languages would add a richness and beauty to life which might well give place to the boasted utilitarianism of most British curricula. But although Lenin's anti-nationalism is to be avoided like the plague, the militarist internationalism of a capitalist order of society should be shunned like the pestilence. The new balance of power would then be the balance of classes, the possessors in every country leagued against the possessed in every land. Victory would go to that side which controlled the fighting material. All the disorders of the old system would afflict the new, with the added terror which increased efficiency would produce. To save the new international organization, the League of Nations, from such an evolution, is enlightened labor's best reason for giving its support to the League. It is labor's business to see that the organization of the League is on thoroughly democratic lines, that it admits at no distant date every country within its fold, and that the broad matters of its discussions not be conducted in secrecy, nor its broad lines of policy be adopted without the knowledge and consent of the peoples of the world themselves. And for the Workers' International, I know of no line of policy which they could adopt more advantageous to themselves than that of educating the public opinions of the various countries included therein to compel their respective governments to disarm. The rationality of total disarmament has always been seriously questioned by those who have passed for wise, but total disarmament by all the nations is the only rational solution of the problems of peace and war. Such action may have to be gradual, it must certainly be taken in concert. But if the responsible statesmen of all lands would together lead the van, and, scorning vested and professional interests, would declare for the plowshare and the pruning hook instead of the sword and the spear, the hosts of mankind would joyfully follow them in such a holy crusade. It may be that men and women will have to wade through oceans of suffering before they recognize modern warfare for the organized filthiness it is. There was a certain personal dignity in physical strife when men met with bare hands, or with a stick, or even a single sword, the human foe equally equipped. But the modern machine gun, the tank, the poison gas, the fighting airplane, all the resources of science used against the innocent and guilty alike, women, old folks, and babes, what single element of dignity or decency in such a conflict? Honor, democracy, freedom, the pledged words setting the monstrous machine in motion, since men are too good in the mass to fight for anything less than these. And lurking in the shadow, anxious but safe, that insatiable dragon of greed, which for oil wells and mining interests and timber concessions and gold fields will see millions of men welter in blood, and millions of children and their mothers succumb to famine and disease. Which brings me to my final word, that for the evils which afflict mankind there is no remedy save the elimination of selfishness, which is the whole of the law and the prophets. Selfishness in the individual, selfishness in the state. When it is universally recognized that every child born is entitled to the development of all the perfection of which it is capable, when the equal rights of nations, great and small, are admitted by all the states in council, when the power of law and not the rule of force is the governing factor in the relations of men and nations, then begins the new era. On such a foundation only can the true international order be securely built. End of section 17. Read by Ciufi Galeazzi, Rohnert Park, California. End of A Political Pilgrim in Europe by Mrs. Phillips Snowden.